Hello, my name's Amanda Little and welcome back to the Little Quilt House. As I promised you last week, here is the completed Minerva make. This is the Cielo dress by Closet Case Patterns and it's in the Bordeaux coloured cotton linen mix fabric which was gifted to me by Minerva in return for a blog post. In today's video I'm going to show you step by step how I made the dress, and then at the end we'll take a closer look at it and I'll give you my feedback. So the fabric that I've used to make this first version is the Minerva fabric, and it is great. I do like it. I am really pleased with the way it's turned out. As I said before, the only thing that bothered me, it was a much darker colour on screen and when it arrived, and once I'd washed it, it bled a heck of a lot, and I don't know, just for some reason I just don't feel new. It just feels a little bit wishy-washy. It's a great dress. I absolutely love the pattern. I'm going to revisit the pattern. They make a cropped version, a cropped top. They do a big balloon sleeved version, so I shall definitely be getting my money's worth from that pattern. As I say, it's a great dress, really easy fit, drop shoulder, turn back and sewn cuffs, so they're always going to stay neat and tidy. Nice big pockets. Get your pegs in the pockets. But no, it's the sort of dress that you would wear on a weekend just to pop to the shops or to the farmer's market. You know, just chuck it on and forget about it. Really nice and loose, especially in the warmer weather that we had recently. It did come up a little bit bigger perhaps than I thought. I've made up a size 14C and I know I'm carrying a heck of a lot too much weight, but I still think that I could afford to size down, and perhaps in the next version I will do. This is one of my own fabrics from my stash. It's a really lightweight linen. This one was much nicer to work with, I have to say. This one was fine, it frayed a lot, but it's got that sort of bubbly texture and a really open loose weave, so it was quite stretchy to work with. This one was a lot more stable. And I do sort of the two together. I just prefer the crisper finish. That perhaps is sort of more my style than this, you know, sort of casual, sloppy kind of look. It's used, I think, this one was just a 45-inch wide fabric and I'd got 2.5 metres and I've still got some fabric left over. So it's a really good pattern for, you know, those shorter cuts of fabric that you might have, and if you've got quilt weight fabric you can get a size 14 definitely from just under 2.5 metres. So the step-by-step video that you're about to see did start with this Bordeaux coloured fabric, but I felt that it was really difficult to distinguish between the fabric and the thread whilst I was sewing. So changed tack and moved to the bronze coloured fabric. I think it works. You can see the thread and you can see the fabric. I do hope you enjoy it. If you do, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, it would mean the world to me if you did. And I will see you after the video for a big twirl. So I've printed off my paper patterns at 100%. I've got my ruler, an old rotary cutter and some sellotape. We're now going to assemble the PDF pattern. The first step of assembling the PDF pattern is to trim the pages. From every page, I like to trim off the right hand side edge and the bottom edge. You can use paper scissors and cut each page one at a time, or you could use a paper cutter and trim a few together. I like to use an old small rotary cutter that I keep just purely for cutting out PDF paper patterns. Your patterns will all be labelled up alphanumerically, so that you can position them in the correct order. You need to line up the marks. On this pattern it's that small triangle on each page, and then I've just used clear sellotape to tape the pages together. Make sure that you're lining up the edges and that they're really straight and all the pages are laying flat. I like to use the Burda tissue paper for tracing the pattern pieces off. It's nice and thin, you can see through it really well, and it's inexpensive. To trace the pattern off accurately, start by making sure that the pattern itself is nice and flat. If it's crumpled, give it a press. Lay your tracing paper on top and secure everything down with sellotape or perhaps some pattern weights. I wouldn't use pins because they can make the paper rise up and crumple. and just change the shape that you're trying to trace off. I use just an ordinary pencil so I can erase any mistakes. I use just short light strokes, making sure that I transfer across any of the notches, gathering points, grain lines, that sort of thing. Don't forget to label your pattern pieces with the name of the pattern, what the piece is, the size and any fitting adjustments that you've made to it. Now I have a long torso and I always need to add length to the pattern pieces. I'm going to add my standard 2 inches here. So taking the back pattern piece, I'm going to cut along that lengthen and shorten line. I'm using a rotary cutter and ruler. You could do it just as easily with a pair of scissors. And then tape a piece of paper that's as long as the length you want to add. My paper is 2 inches, so I've drawn 2 parallel lines 2 inches apart. Tape the lower piece of your pattern to the 2-inch strip of paper. Extend the grain line or the fold line. Now matching up that grain line to the grain line that's on the top piece of your pattern, tape the pieces together. True up the seam lines so that they match up again, and trim the excess paper away. Once the excess paper's trimmed away, I like to reinforce the join with some tape and just double check that I've extended it by the correct length. In the same way as before, cut along the lengthen and shorten line and insert a 2-inch piece of tissue paper. You may need to shorten your pattern. This can be done in a similar fashion. Instead of adding additional tissue paper, just overlap the original pattern pieces, making sure that those grain lines match and that you've overlapped them by the correct amount. So here's the back pattern piece with 2 inches of length added, the front pattern piece with 2 inches of length added. Check that the notches are all in the correct place and match up. Prepare your fabric by following the manufacturer's instructions for washing. Allow your fabric to dry and iron out any creases before cutting. Fold your fabric in half, sometimes selvage to selvage, other times into the middle. Where the instructions say to place the paper pattern on the fold of fabric, place the fabric section right side up against the fold and pin in place. It was difficult to distinguish the front from the back of the fabric. I marked the front with a safety pin. I've folded my fabric, trying to be as frugal as possible. I like to use scissors to cut out, but you could also use a rotary cutter and mat. If you're using scissors, try and keep the scissors flat on the surface that you're cutting out on, and take nice, smooth snips. Once I've cut out as much as I can fit on the table in one go, I just shimmy the fabric along, pin out the next few pieces and continue cutting. When you lay out your pattern pieces, there's usually a line called the grain line, which has to run parallel with the grain of the fabric. To make sure the paper pattern's in the right position, use a tape measure or a quilter's rule to measure that the line is the same distance from the fold of fabric all the way along. Once we've cut out all of our pattern pieces in our fashion fabric, we need to transfer all the marks, the notches, to the fabric. I'm going to snip mark the notches. You need to make sure that your snips are shallow, no more than 1/4 of an inch deep. Don't snip too deeply as this is going to weaken your seam. For a single notch, just clip once. For a double notch, clip twice. Snip marking's only really recommended if your seam allowance is at least 5/8 of an inch. Now we're going to transfer our pattern markings. I'm using Burda Dressmaker's carbon paper to put the markings on. I'll leave a link in the description below. You'll need to mark both layers of your fabric. You place the tracing paper face down on the fabric with a pattern on top and then run the wheel over the dart legs. I like to use a serrated tracing wheel. It draws dotted lines on your fabric. Always test whatever method you've chosen on a piece of scrap fabric first, just to make sure it can be easily removed. The chalk marks will wash out later, and they have the benefit of showing you the exact line that you need to sew along. Always put your markings on the wrong side of the fashion fabric, and whichever marking tool you choose, you want to mark as lightly as you can. No dark heavy marks. Remember as well not to press over any of the marks. Heat can set some dies in permanently. We're going to start by sewing the front darts. With the right sides together, fold the front to align the dart notches. Pin them in place through the end of the dart. Sew from the dart notches straight across to that circle mark. Tie off the threads at the dart point to stop them from unravelling. I like to knot them twice and then using an easy thread needle just sink them back into the seam. You want to press your darts down towards the waistline. Repeat on both sides. Next, we're going to sew the front pockets. Place the dress front and the dress pockets right sides together, matching up that curved edge. Match up the side seam notches and the circle markings. Pin in place carefully. It's helpful here to draw a line with a ruler and the removable marking tool and pin the layers together through the circle marks. It'll help you to sew a straight line. I've pinned from the notch to the first circle, the second circle to the third circle, and the fourth circle out to the far left notch. Stitch between the circle markings, backstitching at the beginning and the end to secure. Now we've sewn from those notches to the circles and we've formed our pocket sections. So the curved bottom edge of the pocket with a 5/8 of an inch seam. I've finished the seam with an overlocked edge. You could bind it with bias binding or use a zigzag seam if you don't have an overlocker. Press the pockets down along the straight lines you've stitched earlier. You can, if you want, base the sides of the pocket in place along the side seams. I've chosen to just pin. Now we're going to construct the back of the dress. To assemble the back of the dress, with right sides together, align the back shoulder to the back yoke along that straight shoulder seam, matching the notch. Pin and sew with a 5/8 of an inch seam. Finish the seam and press it up towards the shoulder. As an optional finishing touch, you can top stitch the seam into place. I used my straight stitch foot as a guide, approximately 1/4 of an inch. With right sides together, match the front and back of the dress along the shoulder seams. Sew again at 5/8 of an inch. Finish the seam with the overlocker and press the seams towards the back of the dress. The pattern gives you instructions to finish the neckline with either a facing or with bias tape. Because the facing's more beginner friendly and is better for slightly thicker fabrics, this is the option that I'm going to be doing today. Begin by stay stitching the neckline at just 1/2 an inch away from the raw edge. This is going to prevent the neckline from stretching. You need to apply interfacing to the front and back neck facings. I like to use a woven fusible, Visalina G700. I find this to be a really good interfacing for the small parts on garments, such as collars, cuffs and that sort of thing. Finish the long curved edge of each facing. Again, I'm using my overlocker, but you could use a zigzag stitch. With right sides together, match the front and back neck facings along those straight shoulder seams. Pin and then sew with a 5/8 of an inch seam. Press the seam open. With right sides together, pin the facing to the dress neckline. You want to match the centre front and centre back notches and the shoulder seams. Stitch all around the perimeter at 5/8 of an inch. Grade the seam by 1/4 of an inch and clip along the neckline so that the curve lays nice and flat. Be really careful not to clip past or into your stitching line. Press the seam allowance towards the facing, then we're going to understitch it. Understitching is used to secure the lining or the facing into place and to prevent it from rolling to the outside of the garment. Place your dress on your machine right sides up. The lining or facing will be to the right with the seam allowance pressed flat underneath. Position your needle so that your stitch line will be about 1/8 of an inch to the right of the seam line. Stitch through the layers of the lining and seam allowance. This is going to anchor the facing in place to the seam line on the inside of the garment. Press the lining down along the seam. Turn the facing to the inside of the dress and pin in place all the way around. Top stitch the facing in place 1 inch from the finished edge. You could, if you wanted to, for an invisible finish, tack the facing in place along the shoulder seams, just using invisible hand stitches instead. Now to attach the cuffed short sleeve. The notches along the curved sleeve cap indicate the front and the back of the sleeve. 1 notch indicates the front, double notches indicate the back. Right sides together, align the sleeve to the dress along the arm opening, match those notches. The front notch matches against your dart. Pin around the sleeve cap to evenly distribute the fabric. The instructions ask you to sew 2 lines of long basting stitches, leave long thread tails and just gather them up. I don't think that we need to do this. I think we can ease the sleeve in without using any gathering stitches. Sew in place at 5/8 of an inch. I like to place the sleeve against the feed dogs. This helps to gather any excess fabric as you sew. Finish the seams with the overlocker and then press the seam allowances towards the sleeve. Match the front and back of the dress, right sides together, along those side seams. Make sure that the seams match under the arm. You could baste in place first if you wanted to. Sew along the entire side seam at 5/8 of an inch. Finish the seam with the overlocker and then press the seam allowances towards the back of the dress. With right sides together, Sew the short ends of each sleeve cuff with a 5/8 of an inch seam. You'll need to clip out a little angled point to get the seam to lay flat. Press the seam allowances open. Press the seam cuff in half with wrong sides together. The seamed side is going to have a slight angle to it. This will help it lay nicely against the sleeve. Now match that folded sleeve cuff to the wrong side of the sleeve, aligning the raw edges and the notch. The seam of the cuff should also line up with the side seam of the sleeve. Pin in place and stitch with a 5/8 of an inch seam. Press the cuff sleeve allowance towards the sleeve and the cuff down and away from the sleeve. Grade the seams and understitch the seam allowance to the sleeve. Grading's used in an enclosed seam. It reduces the bulk created by all the layers in the seam allowances. Grading seams involves trimming the seam allowances to different widths. Start with the seam allowance that's going to sit furthest away from the right side of your dress. This is usually the seam allowance that you'll trim down the most, usually to about 1/8 of an inch. Then move on to the next seam allowance and trim that one to 1/4 of an inch. If there are more seam allowances, just continue to trim them down 1/8 of an inch wider than the last one. The widest seam allowance should always be the one that sits closest to the right side of your garment. This is because it will hide all the staggered seam allowances you've created underneath. Press the sleeve cuff up and over to the right side of the sleeve at the seam. Pin in place. To finish, top stitch the sleeve cuff 1/8 of an inch away from that cuff edge. Again, for an invisible finish, you could slip stitch the cuff into place around the perimeter by hand instead. Press the raw edge of the hem of the dress under by a 1/2 inch. Press the seam under again at 2 inches and pin in place. Once you're happy with the length, top stitch the hem in place in the same manner as you did the cuff, 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. Now your dress is complete. I'll show you now, I'll try and get some nice close-ups of my headless friend. I hope you enjoyed the step-by-step footage. I hope it's inspired you to get your sewing machine out and have a go. It's a great pattern, I really would recommend it. It's a really good beginner's pattern, so satisfying, and it only takes an hour or two from start to finish. I hope you enjoyed the footage of the finished garment. I do like to see people's innards. So I hope you like the footage of the seams. It's just a little thing, but I like it to be nice inside as well as outside. Next project then I think that I'm going to tackle, the next Minerva make, is going to be the McCall 6963. And this, I'm going to use that plain ritual viscose jersey in the coffee colour. So I hope you join me for that one. Next week, I think that I might finish off the baby playmat that I did on the Sewing Quarter promotional hour. We need to quilt it, so I'll perhaps go through the long arm quilting procedure with you, and then we need to bind it. So I'll go into a lot more depth about the way that I like to bind my quilts, and I hope that you'll join me for that. I'll leave a link in the description box below for the Sewing Quarter promotional video where I made the log cabin quilt, which could also be made into a baby playmat. So you can get caught up on that and meet me next week to quilt it. If your love of dressmaking is what brought you to my channel today, I'll leave the links to my social media channels in the description box below. Give them a follow and you'll always be first to know whenever there's a new dressmaking video available. Thanks then, and see you next week. Bye!
Do you not want to wave out?
Bye.